Before I begin this tutorial, I want to mention that tempo is only one factor that contributes to an adaptation. I mention this because with lighter load and higher volume, this tempo scheme can contribute to endurance improvements. With heavy load and extremely low volume, it may contribute to strength gains. Consider that and what I'm using this tempo for in your program before passing judgment. I mention this because unlike other variations such as a fast concentric or eccentric tempo schemes, this tempo scheme has many more potential application in programming for different adaptations. If you see PWR by your recommended rep target, this typically means we are targeting the exercise tempo of 0, 0, x 0, depending on the exercise. PWR stands for power, and this is the dominant style of lifting for those looking to maximize strength during a strength program. This tempo scheme is also for training full body explosive force. I'll talk about that in more detail in the later portion of this tempo recap video. But let's see how to perform this tempo with a movement like a deadlift. The deadlift starts on the ground, so we'd be starting with the X, or third digit in the tempo map. This is the concentric portion of the exercise, and X signifies it should be performed in a rapid or explosive manner. You do not pause at the top of the movement and immediately reverse directions at the end position. This is the important part. The power variation is the only variation that you do not control the weight at all on the eccentric portion. Then, when the weight is at rest, you will immediately begin on the next repetition. As I mentioned earlier, this tempo scheme also trains for full body explosive force. During the deadlift, you already naturally engage the entire body during the lift. But let's look at the barbell power row versus the barbell row, where you only move your shoulder, scapula, wrists, and elbows. The barbell power row, on the other hand, incorporates a small jump in rhythm with your body to row the weight. This tempo is primarily reserved for movements where if you drop the weight, you will not be under the weight. For example, you will never see me recommending this tempo scheme if you're performing a barbell squat or barbell flat press, unless I dislike you. I'm joking here, but dropping rapidly into the bottom position of the squat or flat press is dangerous. Catching extremely heavy weight as momentum drives it down is dangerous. Even lighter weight in this scenario will become very heavy. What is the purpose of the power tempo scheme? One such advantage is to increase our efficiency when we train for traditional strength competitions for movements such as the deadlift. When we train for this scenario, the judges do not consider the tempo of the eccentric portion of your deadlift. Your goal is to simply pick up the weight, and by not performing the eccentric portion of this lift, we save energy to train the portion of the lift that matters comes competition day. The second advantage is recovery. When we perform any exercise with sufficient load, the adaptation is both muscular and neurologic. The eccentric portion of each exercise is the most taxing on the muscle tissue and requires a greater amount of time for recovery. Reducing the eccentric portion of the lift will reduce the trainee's fatigue from session to session, which also reduces the risk of injury if they're on a strict regimen to practice form or any other aspect of the sport to be successful. If you're an athlete strength training on your days between practice and games, this may be the best variation for you to train with. Though I'm not stating that this type of training is easy. If you're training with high intensities, you're still at risk for overtraining and injuries. But if you train with this tempo scheme with lower intensities, you're better off than most other variations of tempo. Finally, this tempo scheme is obviously great for developing power or explosive force. I mentioned athletes earlier, but this is the most advantageous tempo scheme to utilize to develop explosive force. Remember, with this tempo scheme, you're using full body force. Typically, you wouldn't do this because it's considered bad form or cheating, but it's recommended to do so with exercises with the power tempo. The conclusion from what I've shared is that this tempo scheme I use for strength programs. Even then, we may alter it to have you, quote, lock out at the top of the deadlift for a second, rather than immediately reversing the movement. When we train up to our 1 rep max, this is the best tempo scheme to use outside the exercises I've mentioned earlier. But of course, those aren't the only ones.